Sean and Patrick Devlin built an empire hidden in plain sight, moving millions of pounds of cocaine through Liverpool's busiest ports. But when elite police task forces finally caught them, a new shadow rose from the ashes, reshaping the city's deadly drug trade. This is the story of how one city's war against cocaine mafias became a battle against an invisible enemy known only as the Ghost. In Liverpool, a city with a proud maritime history and tight-knit communities, an invisible war had been unfolding for years. Behind the scaffolding of gentrification and the hum of matchday crowds, a silent empire had taken root. Cocaine was its currency, and violence was the cost of doing business. On the surface, things looked ordinary: pubs packed with locals, corner shops open late, and families going about their lives. But beneath it all, something darker pulsed through the streets. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as small-time dealers started making more money than ever before. Police chalked it up to the usual cycle of drug trends. But as overdoses rose and paramedics responded to scenes of chaos in seemingly safe neighborhoods, it became clear this wasn't just a spike, it was a takeover. The supply was increasing, the purity was rising, and the methods were becoming more sophisticated. Cocaine wasn't just being sold, it was being managed like a business. Routes were calculated, distributions were timed, fronts were clean, and those at the top remained hidden. These weren't the loud, reckless gangs of the past. They were disciplined, strategic, often invisible. Instead of flashy cars and turf-marking violence, the new generation of traffickers used encrypted phones, ghost businesses, and layers of intermediaries. The profits were astronomical, but the risk seemed lower than ever before. Every arrest was of someone disposable: a runner, a courier, a fall guy. The true powers stayed untouched. Police forces across Merseyside were overwhelmed. Traditional surveillance methods failed. Informants went silent. And just when they thought they had a lead, it evaporated. A new kind of criminal had emerged. One who operated like a CEO but with the ruthlessness of a cartel leader. These were not gangs fighting for control. These were mafias controlling the entire game. As pressure mounted from politicians and the media, authorities realized they weren't just chasing criminals, they were chasing a machine. And the machine was evolving. Every time they shut one part down, another part grew stronger, smarter and harder to trace. Liverpool was no longer just a city with a drug problem. It was a battleground, in a hidden war, and the fight was only just beginning. The breakthrough that police had waited years for came with the fall of the Devlin brothers. Sean and Patrick Devlin weren't street-level dealers or flashy gang leaders. They were businessmen of the underworld. From the outside they appeared to run a legitimate haulage company, with warehouses, lorries and trade routes that spanned the UK and Europe. But hidden within their logistics empire was a sophisticated cocaine pipeline, stretching from the port of Algeciras in southern Spain, all the way to Merseyside. For nearly a decade, they'd moved tons of product without attracting serious attention. Their method was simple but effective. Cocaine was concealed in shipments of fruit, vegetables and other perishables. Customs officers rarely checked time-sensitive containers thoroughly, and the Devlins knew it. Their drivers were loyal, their routes were tested, and every risk was carefully measured. The profits were immense. By the time police began to take notice, the brothers were already operating at a near corporate level, with layers of insulation between themselves and the actual drug handling. But what made the Devlins especially dangerous wasn't just their operation. It was their influence. They had people on their payroll in ports, transport companies, even legal firms. Money laundered through fake investments and offshore accounts kept their lifestyle untouchable. They didn't use violence unnecessarily. They didn't need to. Fear was maintained by reputation alone. They were known for rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal without warning. Bodies were rarely found. Questions were never asked. It was a multi-agency investigation, named Project Coral, that finally brought them down. Working with Spanish authorities and using financial tracking, surveillance drones, and eventually a wiretap planted in a warehouse, investigators were able to map the flow of drugs and money. In a coordinated set of raids across Liverpool and Marbella, police seized over 12 million pounds in cocaine, luxury cars, and encrypted devices. The brothers were arrested within minutes of each other, one in a penthouse apartment, the other outside a golf resort. Their trial drew national attention. By the end, both were sentenced to over 20 years behind bars. It was hailed as a major victory, but within weeks of their arrest, violence spiked across the city. The throne had been emptied, and now everyone wanted to sit on it. After the fall of the Devlin brothers, a fragile silence settled over Liverpool's underworld. Police celebrated their success, believing the worst had passed, but within weeks, that silence cracked, shootings surged, turf wars flared, old alliances collapsed, as smaller crews scrambled to claim what the Devlins had left behind. Yet beneath the chaos, a new order was quietly taking shape, one more calculated, more cautious, and far more elusive. Whispers began to circulate in police intelligence files, and among surviving dealers, someone new was pulling the strings. They called him the Ghost. No real name, no photos, no phone records, just a nickname that spread like wildfire. What made the Ghost different wasn't just his secrecy, it was the way he operated. He didn't take over old routes, he built new ones. He didn't recruit from the streets, he brought in outsiders, people with military training, tech knowledge, and no police records. The Ghost's empire was almost invisible. Couriers were now university students, rideshare drivers, and international travelers with clean passports. Drop sites were disguised as storage units, food delivery hubs, and even mobile pet grooming vans. Drones were used to scout police activity. The cocaine itself came in smaller, smarter shipments, hidden in electronics, engine parts, even children's toys. By the time law enforcement realized a delivery had been made, the product was long gone and already sold. But what shocked investigators most was the absence of any violence linked to the Ghost's crew. There were no public executions, no gang tags, no power plays. Rivals didn't die in shootouts. They simply vanished. Anyone who tried to step into the vacuum left by the Devlins either disappeared or backed off. Fear returned, but this time it was silent and surgical. Police struggled to make progress. Surveillance turned up nothing. Informants refused to speak, and whenever they got close, the trail went cold. It became clear this wasn't a gang, it was an organization. A network operating more like an intelligence agency than a criminal crew. The Ghost had changed the game entirely, and for the first time, the authorities began to ask a terrifying question. What if this wasn't just the next player but the final boss? Faced with an enemy they couldn't see and a network they couldn't touch, Merseyside police knew they needed to change their approach. Traditional policing was no longer enough. What they were up against wasn't just a criminal. The Ghost had built something closer to a multinational syndicate. In response, a new unit was formed, one that operated outside the normal structure of local law enforcement. It was called Task Force Alpha. Task Force Alpha was small but elite. It included cybercrime experts, ex-intelligence officers, financial analysts, and a handful of veteran detectives who'd spent years chasing drug traffickers. Their mission was clear: identify, infiltrate, and dismantle the Ghost's operation from the inside out. But to do that, they needed to understand how it worked. Every layer, every connection, every shadow. The task force began with what little they had. Scraps of intelligence, fragmented phone data, a few grainy site-savvy images. From there, they started building a map. They traced shell companies registered in Eastern Europe, Bitcoin wallets tied to online gambling sites, and shipping containers rerouted through Belgium and Ireland. One lead revealed that a cleaning company in Birkenhead was laundering over £2 million a year. Another exposed a luxury car importer that had no actual customers. They also discovered that the Ghost wasn't relying on old-school gang loyalty. He was paying people very well. Everyone from port officials and freight brokers to customs inspectors and even airport baggage handlers were on the payroll. It wasn't just corruption. It was infrastructure. The operation had been built like a business, with layers of protection, risk management, and backup plans for everything. The deeper the task force went, the clearer it became that they were up against something far more advanced than anything they'd seen. The Ghost had anticipated surveillance, predicted investigations, and planned for disruptions. Encrypted devices were changed every 2 weeks. Meetings happened in different countries. Even facial recognition software had been fooled using prosthetics and fake passports. For Task Force Alpha, success wouldn't come from one big arrest. It would take patience, precision, and the ability to think like a criminal, because this wasn't just a drug network. It was a machine, and machines don't sleep, panic, or bleed. In 2020, an unexpected breakthrough shifted the entire landscape of the investigation. Across Europe, law enforcement agencies had quietly been working on something unprecedented: cracking encrypted, an encrypted messaging service used almost exclusively by organized crime groups. For years, it had allowed traffickers, hitmen, and smugglers to communicate freely, believing their conversations were completely secure. But in a quiet collaboration between French and Dutch police, the system was finally breached. The result was a flood of intelligence like nothing authorities had ever seen. When British agencies saw how the Devlins operated, how they failed, and how the system responded, then slowly, he began building his own version. Cleaner, quieter, more resilient. Where others relied on force, Rourke relied on design. He eliminated weak links, recruited professionals, and treated the operation like a business empire. Task Force Alpha now had a name, but they didn't have proof. Rourke hadn't used phones, credit cards, or anything digital in years. Every move was done through intermediaries. He had no residence, no fixed identity, no traceable assets. But the pieces were starting to fit. The silence, the efficiency, the fear that kept rivals in line, it all pointed to one man operating in total control. They weren't hunting a ghost anymore. They were chasing a man who had rewritten the rules of organized crime. The hunt for Daniel Rourke intensified. With Kane's information narrowing the search, Task Force Alpha shifted focus beyond Liverpool, looking at key shipping routes and international connections. One port stood out, Rotterdam. It was one of Europe's busiest entry points for goods, and increasingly a hotspot for cocaine smuggling. Intelligence suggested that Rourke's network had embedded itself deep within the port's logistics systems, rerouting shipments from South America directly into the UK supply chain with surgical precision. Surveillance began. British and Dutch authorities worked together, monitoring shipping containers, tracking digital manifests, and identifying suspicious freight companies. After weeks of analysis, one container caught their attention. It was registered to a cleaning supplies firm in Manchester with no online presence and no physical office. The cargo was listed as industrial cement mixers, shipped from a company in Colombia that didn't exist. Authorities flagged the container for inspection before it left the docks. Inside, hidden within the machinery, they found 800 kilograms of high-purity cocaine worth over £60 million on the street. It was one of the largest single seizures in the task force's history. Forensics later revealed that parts of the shipment bore fingerprints belonging to 2 of Rourke's known associates, both of whom had dropped off the radar years ago. It was the closest link to Rourke that investigators had found since his alleged death. Despite the breakthrough, Rourke himself remained elusive. No travel records, no communication logs. Every lead ended in a dead end. But the Rotterdam seizure revealed something else, just how advanced the smuggling network had become. The container's path had been altered digitally at the last moment, avoiding customs checks. Fake companies, forged documents, and insider cooperation made the entire operation look legitimate on paper. Even more concerning, the drugs were already prepaid, suggesting a level of trust and organization between supplier and distributor that pointed to long-term, stable relationships. Rourke wasn't just importing drugs. He was running an international business with logistics to rival legal multinationals. The seizure proved that Rourke was still active and expanding. But it also confirmed a darker truth. The more the task force uncovered, the more they realized how deep his operation ran. And they were still only scratching the surface. As the investigation deepened, Task Force Alpha uncovered the complex web that kept Daniel Rourke's empire running. It wasn't just about smuggling drugs, it was about controlling money, information, and power on a level few had seen before. The group realized that the backbone of the operation wasn't just the shipments, but the dark web of financial tools and corrupt connections that kept it hidden from sight. Cryptocurrency became a key element in the network. Unlike cash, Bitcoin and other digital currencies allowed Rourke and his associates to move millions of pounds quickly and without detection. The task force traced numerous cryptocurrency wallets linked to fake online businesses, websites that sold non-existent goods or services. These shell companies existed purely to clean the money, turning dirty cash into digital assets that could be moved anywhere in the world within minutes. Further investigation revealed that these companies were just the tip of the iceberg. Port officials, customs agents and shipping clerks were on the payroll, ensuring that containers slipped through inspections without question. Some workers were paid directly in cash, others received bribes or favors. It was a carefully balanced system where everyone had a role to play. If one part failed, the whole chain could collapse. So Rourke built in multiple layers of redundancy. Technology was used to avoid detection. The task force found evidence of silicone masks designed to fool facial recognition cameras, fake passports, and even 3D printed fingerprints. Meetings between key players rarely happened in person anymore. Instead, secure video calls were arranged from different countries, using changing IP addresses and encrypted messaging apps that were impossible to hack. Rourke's organization also adopted a business-like approach to risk management. Shipments were split into smaller loads and sent through multiple routes. If one shipment was seized, others could still reach their destination. Payments were staggered, and trust was built through contracts, not threats. This made the empire more resilient than any previous criminal network in Liverpool's history. For Task Force Alpha, this was a new challenge. They were no longer fighting criminals who lived on the street corners. They were facing a global, high-tech operation that combined traditional smuggling with cutting-edge technology and financial expertise. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. To bring down Rourke, they would have to become experts in the same tools he used to stay invisible. In early 2024, after years of relentless investigation, Task Force Alpha finally received a crucial tip from Colombia. A trusted informant within the country's anti-narcotics unit reported sightings of Daniel Rourke in a remote villa nestled in the hills outside Medellin. It was an unexpected breakthrough. Rourke had been thought to be hiding somewhere in Europe, constantly moving and changing identities. Now, for the first time, there was a real chance to capture the man who had evaded justice for nearly a decade. A joint operation was swiftly planned. Colombian special forces teamed up with MI6 operatives and British law enforcement to coordinate a covert raid. The villa was heavily guarded, surrounded by armed men loyal to Rourke, some believed to be former military or mercenaries hired for protection. Intelligence suggested that this was more than just a hideout. It was a command center, where Rourke oversaw his international empire. The raid happened at dawn. Helicopters circled overhead as troops approached on foot. There was a brief firefight, but the element of surprise was on the officers' side. Rourke was found inside the villa, calm and unarmed. He didn't resist arrest. His identity was confirmed through biometric scans and fingerprints, a stark contrast to the years of uncertainty that had surrounded his whereabouts. The man who had once been Liverpool's most wanted criminal was finally in custody. Back in the UK, Rourke was extradited to face multiple charges: drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy to murder, and corruption. The evidence against him was overwhelming: financial records, intercepted communications, and testimonies from former associates. Yet, throughout pre-trial proceedings, Rourke remained silent, refusing to cooperate or reveal the full extent of his network. Police and prosecutors hailed the arrest as a major victory in the fight against organized crime. Task Force Alpha had dismantled a network that had cost Liverpool millions in lost lives and shattered communities. But even as celebrations erupted, there was an unspoken understanding among investigators. Rourke's empire might be weakened, but it was far from destroyed. The war was far from over. The arrest was just the beginning, and the next chapter would prove even more dangerous. With Daniel Rourke behind bars, many expected Liverpool's cocaine trade to collapse. Instead, a new challenge emerged, one that revealed just how deeply entrenched the criminal network had become. Despite the leader's capture, shipments continued flowing, money still moved, and pockets of violence persisted. It became clear that Rourke's empire was no longer dependent on a single man. The system he had built was bigger, smarter, and more resilient than anyone imagined. In the months following the arrest, Task Force Alpha shifted focus from individuals to dismantling the entire infrastructure. They began targeting the businesses, both legitimate and fake, that facilitated money laundering and logistics. More undercover agents were placed within ports, transport firms, and financial institutions. The goal was to cut off the lifelines that kept the operation alive. Surprisingly, new players soon stepped into the void. Younger, tech-savvy criminals who had learned from Rourke's example started replicating his methods, but added their own innovations. Encrypted networks evolved further, making surveillance even harder. Cryptocurrencies diversified, with new privacy coins making transactions nearly impossible to trace. Instead of a single kingpin, Liverpool now faced a decentralized web of smaller but highly organized groups. This fragmentation made law enforcement's job far more complex. Without a clear target, efforts were spread thin. But Task Force Alpha refused to relent. They began working closely with international agencies, sharing intelligence and coordinating raids across borders. The police realized that this war wasn't just local, it was global. Communities in Liverpool also began to play a crucial role. Grassroots campaigns raised awareness about the devastating impact of cocaine trafficking, encouraging people to come forward with information. Rehabilitation programs expanded, aiming to reduce demand and break the cycle of addiction that